Good afternoon, everyone. Without further ado, I am pleased to welcome your fellow Glenaire resident who will be talking about the history of Cary. Let's give a warm welcome to Peggy Van Scoyoc.
Hello, neighbors. I moved in to the 1000 building on September 10th. So I am brand new here, but I'm so glad to be here and to get to know all of you. So anyway, so I want to tell you a little bit about me. I have been on the board of the Friends of the Page Walker History Center and Preservation Society for many years. And as such, we are trying to preserve Cary's history in every way we can to have it available for posterity. And as part of my involvement with the board, I am also Cary's oral historian. That's why I'm here today. So we started an oral history program at the Page Walker in 1998. And since then, we have done well over 100 interviews with folks who've lived here a long time. And we've recorded them and to document that history as they remember it. And so as we were going along, and I was hearing all these wonderful stories, it's like, how can we get this out to the public? So I started compiling them into 2 books that I self-published. Here they are. The first one is called Just a Horse Stopping Place, An Oral History of Cary, North Carolina, which is the book I'll be talking mostly about today, and the second book, Desegregating Cary, tells the story about Cary's involvement with desegregating our schools and the civil rights era. So those 2 books, a copy of each of the books are in the Glenaire Library, just so you know. I also sell the books, and proceeds from the sale of the books go back to the town to help us continue to preserve Cary's history. So they are for sale. If anyone would like one, see me later, we'll talk. Anyway, so without further ado, I'm going to tell you today about Cary's very earliest history, how Cary came about, and how it started to develop over time. So, in the beginning, there were Native Americans here. It was the Tuscarora Indian tribe, and they were pretty much all over this whole area, what is encompassed in today's Cary. And so we have artifacts that have been dug up, often by developers who were digging foundations and would find arrowheads or pottery shards or what have you, and mostly near water sources, so near streams or lakes or creeks, which makes sense. Anyway, when North Carolina was still a British colony, the very first white settler arrived in Cary in 1749. His name was Francis Jones, and he arrived here with a land grant, a British land grant of 640 acres, right where downtown Cary is today. So he cleared the land, and he built himself a little house and probably a barn, and he started to farm. So in somewhere between 1760 and 1774, his grandson, Fanning Jones, acquired some land here in Cary, and on his land there was a bit of a rise. And he chose that spot to build his house, and what he built was a 2-story house that had very high ceilings. And so that house could be seen from all over, everywhere. There was nothing out there around his land. And so people started calling it the High House. That's it. That picture is what it looked like in 1916. It was near the intersection of High House Road. Imagine that. And also near the intersection with Maynard Road, probably on the south side of High House, probably across from Briggs Restaurant, if you know where that is. It was occupied by many family members over time, and then it became vacant. And somewhere around 1925, it burned down. The other thing to know about the High House is that it was very largely believed that it was haunted. Anyway, throughout time, as the white settlers started to arrive, clear their land, set up farms, mills began to be built all over the place. There were so many mills all around, both sawmills and grist mills, and there were many, including one that was built in 1810 by a man named Anderson Page. It was built in what is today Umstead State Park, which is also part of Cary, and it was the largest around of that whole area. And many years later, a group of men came together and they bought the mill as a business together, and then they changed the name of it from Page's Mill to the Company Mill. That mill operated for 110 years. It was a grist mill, and then there was a big flood in around 1920, and it took out the building. However, the foundations are still there, so we still have a reminder of it. I forgot to advance. That's what it looked like. Sorry. That's the Company Mill. Okay. Okay, I need to tell you about the Joneses. Starting with Francis Jones. Francis had another grandson, and his name was Nathaniel Jones. And Nathaniel ended up with a huge amount of land that encompassed the entire west side of what is today's Cary. It was a huge plantation. And then in 1790, completely unrelated, a man also named Nathaniel Jones arrived in Cary, and he ended up with a whole lot of land that encompassed the entire east side of what is today's Cary. So to keep both of the Nathaniels straight, they designated the west side Nathaniel as Nathaniel Jones of Crabtree Creek, and then the east side plantation, he was known as Nathaniel Jones of White Plains. Okay, so Nathaniel of Crabtree Creek had a son, Henry, and Nathaniel of White Plains had a daughter, Nancy. Guess what happened? Yes, they married and they joined the two families together. Nancy didn't even have to change her name. So anyway, so when Nathaniel of Crabtree Creek, he built a house in 1803, and it faced Chapel Hill Road, which did exist at that point, and it was a two-story white house, which I can show you. There it is. Okay, when he died, his son Henry inherited the house, and then Henry didn't live to be a ripe old age. So when he died, his widow Nancy, of course, inherited the house, and she lived a long time. So Nancy eventually turned that house into a stagecoach stop. right along Chapel Hill Road, where the stagecoaches would stop, they'd water the horses, they would provide food and drink and rest to the travelers. And there it is. and we still have it today. It still exists. That is the oldest house in Cary, built in 1803. And moving out in time, many people lived in it, and eventually the town bought it and owned it. And the Preservation Society of the Page Walker decided we definitely wanted to try and save that house and continued to have it preserved. So there are 3 houses in Cary that the Preservation Society designated as the LDIFOB houses. This was one of them. That stands for Lay Down in Front of the Bulldozers. We weren't going to let anything happen to that house. So anyway, moving ahead in time, 20-some years ago, I'm guessing, the Hindu temple folks came along and they bought the land just west of the Nancy Jones house along Chapel Hill Road, and it actually included the house and the land that the house was sitting on. And they needed that land, but they didn't care about the house. So they made a deal with the town, and so the town agreed to move it. But where to? Now, the house had a National Register designation, and so we didn't want that to be lost. Fortunately, the town was able to find a lot 500 feet east, still facing Chapel Hill Road, so it managed to hang on to its National Register, which we're very happy about, and it did get moved. So it's been saved. We still have it. The town is in the process of preserving it and restoring it. So it still remains to be seen what the town will do with it once it's restored. We're holding our breath to find out what that might be. Okay. In 1815, a man arrived in Cary named John Bradford, and he also inherited, he obtained the Francis Jones property. That's what he did. And he built something called the Bradford's Ordinary on his land. An ordinary was an inn or a tavern, and it was right, again, on Chapel Hill Road. And so all of the travelers going from eastern North Carolina clear out to Chapel Hill and beyond had a place to stop and take a rest. And so it became a landmark place for travelers coming through this area. And then in 1838, a man named Eli Yates arrived in Cary, and he ended up buying the Bradford's land, including the Ordinary, converted it into his own home. He farmed, he had 4 sons, and he had a fair amount of land. He wasn't the first Yates, though, to arrive in this part of North Carolina, because one of his relatives, a Yates, built Yates Mill in Raleigh, if you've all heard of that, and it still exists, and you can go see it. So same family, but different branch. Okay, so moving ahead in time. Okay, in 1840, Hillcrest Cemetery in Cary was established for a resting place for prominent people in the town. And it is very close to where we are sitting and standing right now. There is an opening gate, which is you can find at 608 Page Street. That's where you would come down Page Street to the main gates to go into the cemetery. And the Friends developed a walking tour brochure of the cemetery, and they're at the gate. So pick one up. I highly recommend that you go there and you see the cemetery. It's a beautiful place, but it tells so much of our history. And the brochure will point out the different graves, where they are in the cemetery, and then give you a little bio of each of those people so you can learn about them. Okay, moving ahead in time. 1854. Cary wasn't an actual place yet until 1854. So what put Cary on the map was when the railroad arrived, came through Cary. The Southern Railroad was the first one to arrive here in 1854, and the railroad built a depot, and trains started to come through town. And that put Cary on the map. Then, in 1868, a second railroad came through, laid down their own tracks right next to the southern tracks, and you might have noticed there are 2 train tracks going down through Cary. Those were laid then. So I would assume they've been maintained since then, but still. Anyway, and the Seaboard also built a depot. So there were 2. There were 2 depots here. Then in 1939, they decided to tear down the Southern Depot, and then both trains shared the Seaboard Depot. And that's what it looked like. It's a drawing of it. Thank you, Jerry Miller. And both of them shared that depot from 1939 to 1965. They renamed it the Union Station. And then, for some unexplained reason, the town decided to tear it down. And Cary didn't have a depot at all. I think they went, oops, when they realized what they had done. So they decided, I guess we need to build another depot. So they did. And it opened in 1996 finally. So now it's the depot we have here now. Okay, but going back to 1854, first train arrives. The other thing that happened that year, this was a banner year for Cary, a man arrived here named Frank Page. Frank was a lumberman. So he was looking for a place that had a lot of trees, which we did, and a train so that he could ship his lumber out on the train to his customers. And Cary filled that bill. So he came here, he bought Yates' property, and took over Yates' house and converted and expanded it for his family and his growing family, what is right now downtown Cary. He built a sawmill, which makes sense since he was a lumberman. Then he donated the land that he owned and probably some of the wood for that first depot with the Southern Railroad near his house. And then 1 year after he got here in 1855, he built a general store. And in that store was a post office, and he became the first postmaster. And then in 1870, he donated the land and the lumber to build a white school for his 8 children. And it was called Cary Academy. And so the street that ran from his house to that dead-ended right in front of the school was named Academy Street. There you go. Okay, another thing that Frank did. In 1871, then, he laid out a town with the streets and the crossroads and everything else that needed to be there so that it could be incorporated. It hadn't been named yet, though. And to put it truly on the map, it needed a name. Well, Frank didn't name his town Pagetown, Pageville, Page anything, Page's Station, which is what it had been referred to by the railroads. No. Frank was a temperance leader. He often lectured about temperance. And another man who believed in temperance, came down from Ohio, who was a preacher. He came down here. He was going all over the South preaching about temperance. And the two men met. And Frank was so taken by this man who arrived in 1871, right when Frank was finishing up his town, that he decided to name the town after this man. His name? Samuel Fenton Cary. Okay, so Sam finished his tour around the South. He went back home and he never darkened our door again. The other thing to know about Sam is that, realize this is 6 years after the end of the Civil War, okay? He came from Ohio. He had been a general, which means Cary was named after a Yankee general. It's true. Anyway, so the town was incorporated when there was a whole whopping 150 people living here. Frank became the first mayor, big surprise, and he carried on with his businesses. So, just to jump way ahead in time, the Page House burned down and it was empty in 1970, and the town bought the land, and so they built Town Hall on his land where it is today. So just so you can locate where Frank's house originally was. And I keep forgetting to advance this. There's Frank. There he is. This is the man who did everything for our town. So, but he did other things too. He was a busy guy. So, in 1868 then, Frank, even before he incorporated his town, Frank decided to build a railroad hotel facing the railroad tracks that went right in front of his house. And so he built it right next to his house, and it was originally called the Page Hotel. And so it was to service the train passengers coming through town. And then in 1884, he sold the hotel to a man named Jake Walker. And so, of course, now that hotel building is known as the Page Walker Hotel. So, what else did Frank do? Okay, so this is what the Page Walker looked like in 1916. So the Page Walker was run by the Walkers for many years, excuse me, as a hotel. It was owned by many other people. It was a boarding house. It was a private home. All kinds of people kind of came and went in that house. But eventually it was empty and it fell apart, basically. It really should have been torn down. It was just really desolate. And then came in our friend, Ann Kratzer. Sorry, Ann. I had to do it. Ann arrived before this, and she started the Cary Historical Society to try and save the important papers for the town, and then many buildings and anything else that could be saved and preserved, excuse me, for the town. But the focus of this group became more and more this hotel. They didn't want it to disappear because they felt it was a very important building. And so they changed the name of the Historical Society to the Friends of the Page Walker Hotel. And then they started a huge campaign to raise the money, to find the right people, to bring everybody in to try and save this building. And ultimately, they did a great job, and they got it as far as they could. But eventually, the town came in and bought it, and they finished saving it and restoring it. And today, it is the community center, hotel, history center, everything else that it is today. And we have many people to thank for that. On the third floor of the Page Walker today is a museum about Cary. So if you have never been to the Page Walker Hotel, which is now the Page Walker History Center, I truly encourage you to go there. There is a brochure that's a walking tour, if you will, of the building and the history and the grounds. And then you can go see the museum too. And it's small, but boy, there's a lot packed into that museum, and it's well worth a visit. So, okay. Frank did a couple more things. Okay, Frank. This is the school that Frank had started for his children at the head of Academy Street. It was originally called Cary Academy, as I said before. The railroad put Cary on the map, but the very heart of Cary, from the beginning to this day, was education. Because of that school, that's how it started. The school started out as a private boarding school, and it was very, very well thought of. And so people wanted to send their kids here because, along with regular coursework, they also taught girls home ec and boys farming and agriculture. So the kids came. And so ultimately, dorms were built and what have you. So the original building that Frank built in 1870 was wood. And so it got too small and it was old. So in 1913, well, first of all, I'm jumping ahead of myself here. In 1896, the school's name was changed from Cary Academy to Cary High School. And then in 1907, North Carolina decided to begin financing public education in North Carolina. And that passed in 1907, and Cary got the first funds of all of the entire state. So Cary was the first publicly funded school in North Carolina. There were, 1907, there were like 200 people living here. But still, our school got that designation. Anyway, in 1913 then, the wooden building was too small, it was old, and so it was torn down and was replaced by a brick building. I believe, well, maybe that isn't it. It might be that building that you're seeing in the aerial shot there. Anyway, and then, because dorms were built for the boarding children, and then it continued to be a boarding school, even though it was publicly funded. But then when the Depression hit in 1933, people couldn't afford to even send their kids here from elsewhere. And so the dorms closed. And then in 1938, that building was too small, the brick building was too small, and it needed expansion and an update. So it was torn down, a whole new building was built by the WPA during the Depression. So anyway, and it is the building that is there today, the head of Academy Street, which of course is now the Cary Arts Center. So thank you, Frank, again. Okay, Frank did one more thing, and then we'll leave Frank. Okay, Frank had 8 children, I think I mentioned. His oldest, his name was Walter Hines Page. He was born in 1855. And to this day, Walter is our most famous son of Cary. Why? Well, for many reasons. Number one, all of Frank's children were very successful, but Walter shined brightest. He became one of the original founders of the newspaper that preceded the News and Observer. He then moved to New York City, and he started a little publishing house originally called Doubleday Page. He wrote a number of books, copies of which are at the Page Walker Hotel. And then, the biggest thing in his life, in 1913, President Woodrow Wilson appointed him as ambassador to Great Britain 1 year before World War I broke out. Walter, our Walter, became very instrumental in getting the United States into that war. And there are only 3 Americans who are today honored at Westminster Abbey, and Walter is one of them. There's a plaque there that says, out under his name, "The friend of Britain in her sorest need." That's our Walter. Anyway, I'll just put in a little plug here. Okay. One of my favorite authors is Eric Larson. If any of you have ever read any of his books, maybe 10 years ago or so, he came out with a book called Dead Wake. It tells the story of the sinking of the Lusitania, as told by both the people on the boat and the people in the submarine who shot it down with the torpedo. Dead wake means the wake behind a torpedo, just so you know. Anyway, I'm bringing that up right now because our Walter is in that book in 3 places. Anyway, I'm just so proud of that. Okay. So, moving ahead in time. Okay, 1874, this house was built. It is now called the Ivy Ellington House. Everybody always thought it was a church at one time. It was never a church. It was always a house on West Chatham Street. That's where it was built. And it was on the National Register. Also, in that one block, next to the Ivy Ellington, I'll just mention, was a store building that originally had Scott's store in it, and then that became Elizabeth's store. And that was built in 1898. And then across the street was another store that was built in 1917 that for many, many, many years was called Everybody's Store. And those 2 store buildings are still there, we hope. And we don't know how long we're going to hang on to them, but we've got our fingers crossed. But anyway, the Ivy Ellington was in the way of development. So the giant construction going on the corner of Harrison and Chatham, which we all probably pass every time we go anywhere, because it's so close to us here, is that construction. So the Ivy Ellington had to be moved. Again, the town owned it by that time, and so the town did move it to Academy Street, right across from the park, the new park. And so you can see it there today. There's a fence around it because they're still in the process of stabilizing and restoring it. And the short-term plan for that building is it to become offices for the park administration. And we'll see after that what might become of that house. Okay, so in 1879, a man was here in town called Robert Harrison. Robert Harrison had a business called Harrison Wagon Works. Of course, the street, Harrison Avenue, was named for him because that's near where his factory was. He was a smart guy. He had 5 different patents. His most successful one was for a cotton cultivator. And his wagon works grew into a factory, a large factory, and at one point he employed 75 people, which was the largest employer in all of Wake County for years, right here in Cary. Anyway, and then after the turn of the century, when cars started to come out, he expanded his business to auto repair to try and, also continue to make wagons and fix cars. But finally, in 1913, he closed the factory. So, okay, early 1900s, the Gray brothers arrived, and they built a large general store right on the corner of Chatham and Academy, right where the big Fidelity Bank is now. That was Gray's store. And next to it, there was also a public well and also a cotton gin. And behind the store was the Gray's home. And it was very popular. It was a big general store for many years. And once the Grays started to die out, eventually the store was closed and the building was torn down in 1939. But here's the thing. By the 1930s, this is so hard to believe, but it is true, in a 2-block section of Chatham Street in Cary, there were seven mom and pop grocery stores in that 2-block section of Cary. Why? How could they possibly compete? There weren't a whole lot of people here. Well, I can tell you why. In 1928, the state routed all of the new to-be-built U.S. highways. And so highways 1, 64, 70, and 54 went right down Chatham Street. And so all these businesses popped up on Chatham Street. So there were gas stations, there were auto repairs, there were 2 motels, there were restaurants, and there were the 2 drugstores had lunch counters. I mean, you know, they had to service all these cars coming through. If you were going from New York to Florida, you went down Chatham Street. That was your only option. That was true until 1962. When finally the state rerouted highways 1 and 64 to where they are today. They had already, I think, moved Highway 70. And 54, which briefly was on Chatham Street, they straightened out and just kept it on Chapel Hill all the way down. So there you go. Okay, so in 1932, a man named Henry Adams was a pharmacist, and he came to town, and with the Masonic Lodge, they built a brick building on the corner of Academy and Chatham Street. You recognize this, of course. Henry had his pharmacy on the ground floor, which was Adams Rexall, and above on the second floor was the Masonic Temple. And there is a cornerstone on that building today that has the Masonic emblem. Probably never noticed it, but it is there. Of course, in 1957, Henry sold the pharmacy to Ralph Ashworth, and it belonged to the Ashworth family until very recently. Should we have a moment of silence? It's closed. It's so sad. I know. Anyway, okay, moving along. So, okay, I want to read something to you. Okay, so near the intersection of 55 and High House, that intersection and a whole lot of land around it belonged to the Johnson Tobacco Farm. It was a very large farm. And if you go up Highway 55 from that intersection, there's a hill, and almost at the top of the hill on the east side is a big square brick house. That was the Johnson house. So I want to read to you what Raymond Johnson told me when I interviewed him in that house. 1943, Raleigh-Durham Airport was just built during the early part of World War II. On the top of this house, there is a porch, an open deck. At the airport, they train pilots for the military in Piper Cubs, a little bitty one-motor airplane. We'd be in the field, plowing. the airplanes would come over and buzz us. Scared the old mule. The mule would run across the field and you'd get mad. This happened in the mornings all the time. They would buzz down, scared the mule. Come to find out, every morning about 10 o'clock, my sisters would go up and take their sun bath up there in their bathing suits. They weren't buzzing us, they were buzzing the sun deck, but they were still scaring our mules. I love that story. Okay, where am I? Okay, 1960. In 1960, the white school at the head of Academy Street was just about to, blow the doors off. It was just, they had expanded so much, it was so crowded. They realized that they needed a high school. So they went way out in the middle of nowhere. They bought some land, probably inexpensively, clear out on Walnut Street, and they built one. It opened in 1960, the very same one that's there today. Okay, 3 years later, in 1963, that high school was the very first one to be desegregated in Wake County. And Cary then became a leader in how to go about desegregating your high schools because it was done early and it was successful. And that whole story, before, during, and after civil rights, is told in this book, which is another topic for another day. But I could return and tell you about it sometime. Anyway, just so you know. Okay, let's see. In 1960 as well, Research Triangle Park opened. Now, for those of you who may be new to this part of the world, Research Triangle Park is also called RTP, and it was opened as an industrial park. Then things started to happen. Okay, I have one more thing I want to read to you. Also in 1960, you probably have all seen the Andy Griffith Show. And if you recall, he'd go over to his phone and he'd pick up the phone and he'd say, "Sarah, get me so-and-so," right? Well, we had one of those, only ours was, they called ours Central. So they would pick up their phone and say, "Central, get me so-and-so." Okay, so Bob Heater told us this story about telephones. Okay, Len Banks' granddaddy still had, oh, there's Cary High School, sorry. I keep forgetting to advance the thing. Okay, and that's what it still looks like today. There we go. Okay, Len Banks still had the old crank phone on the wall. All up and down 1010 Road, if they wanted to call Raleigh, there was one house that had a Raleigh phone. So everybody would have to ring so many rings to give you different houses, and it was all party line. They'd ring to that house that had the phone to Raleigh and say, "Give me so-and-so in Raleigh." Those poor people had to relay all the phone calls for everybody that lived up and down 1010 Road on that old crank phone. 1960, RTP was just opening. I know, hard to believe. Okay, 1964, this is also an incredible thing to learn. In honor of R. Frank Page, Cary was incorporated as a dry town and stayed that way until 1964. The very first liquor license was finally issued in Cary in 1964. Up until then, you could not buy a drink, alcohol, wine, nothing here. Isn't that something? Okay, in 1965, in RTP, IBM breaks ground. They were starting to build. And because of that and other businesses that were starting to come into and build in RTP, Cary became the bedroom community for all those people who were coming here for jobs. And it started to explode. So 1970 was the watershed year. So just to illustrate that, I'm going to quickly give you the population of Cary over time, so you can kind of see this. So 1900, there were 333 people. 1910, 383. 1920, 645. 1930, 909. 1940, 1141. 1950, 1500. 1960, 3350. 1970, 7,640. Am I saying this right? 3350, 7640. Okay. 10 years later, 1980, 21,750. 1990, 43,850. 2000, 94,536. 2010, 139,000. And 2020, 175,000. And today, I think we're up to about 185,000, which means it probably grew about 10,000 in the last 4 years. I will end there with the growth and what became today's Cary. So anyway, I will open it up to questions. Anybody have a question? Yes, ma'am. Yes.
Cary's nickname.
Cary has 2 nicknames. The first is, hang on. Thank you. Containment area for relocated Yankees. That's it. The second one that I heard was can't afford Raleigh yet. Yeah, thank you. Yeah. Anyone else? Any other questions? No? Oh, yes. Oh,
Tell us about the Black Cemetery down the street here.
yes,
And
yes.
the black school that I think was adjacent to the white cemetery for some period of time.
Yes.
And then they moved it, and this seems,
Yeah, so what happened? Okay, so the cemetery right next to us here belongs to the Cary First Christian Church, and our very own Sally Jones saved that cemetery from developers and from it disappearing. She worked tirelessly for like 25 years. She did all the research. She was phenomenal. And just Monday, this is so great, Sally won the designation as Cary's Hometown Spirit Award winner for 2024. Sally is 100 years old. I know, isn't that great? Anyway, so we're very glad to have that cemetery. They found 160 graves in that cemetery that there were no stones, no nothing, and so a lot has been done with that cemetery. The black school, it was called Cary Colored School. It was near here, very near here, and it was the Cary First Christian Church originally was on Shirley Drive or very close to Shirley Drive, and the black school was next to it. And in 1936, it was burned down. So it was probably arson. Nothing ever happened about that. But the black community came together, came up with land and money, and they rebuilt a school for their elementary school kids. And that, today, it still exists, and today it's called Kingswood Elementary School. So anyway, yeah. So there were a few more hands. Yes.
A number of years ago, I sold a lot over in a community off of Seabrook, but a little bit more, where it was Nathaniel Jones' grave.
Yes,
Is that still maintained there and by the Historical Society or what?
it is. Yes, the Friends of the Page Walker still maintain that cemetery. And that Nathaniel Jones of White Plains, yeah, thank you. I get them mixed up. He is known for, he died in 1815, and he put in his will to free all of his slaves. Sadly, legally, they weren't allowed to be freed, but he tried. But yeah, so he is honored, and that was his cemetery right there, and it's still there.
Well, that little cemetery has now got a wrought iron fence around it, and the last time I saw it, which was probably 10 years ago, it looks very nice.
Yeah.
And so I just wanted to let you all know that you don't have to go very far to find that, but you would do better about telling them exactly where it is.
Yeah, thank you. Anyway, yes, the Friends have adopted it, and we maintain it. So, yes, back here.
I'm related.
Wait, please.
I'm loud. I'm related to the Maynard family who owned
Oh.
farmland on Park.
Yes.
And a lot of that towards Cary High School before that was built. So
Oh, okay.
they're part of the Cary.
Yes.
What did the eating place Serendipity used to be? Was that a library at one time?
It was. The Cary Women's Club established the first libraries in Cary. And yes, it was an early, if not the first, library, I think. It was one of the very earliest libraries before it became Serendipity. That's very true. It was a doctor's office, too. Okay, yes.
I understand there was a racetrack in town.
A racetrack. Okay, that's a new one on me. We had a drive-in movie theater, but I don't know about a racetrack. Huh. Okay, sorry, I can't clarify that one for you. Anyone else? Oh, yes, ma'am.
Are there other historic homes that the Page Friends own, and what are they?
The two other laid down in front of the bulldozer houses were, okay, so, the first was Nancy Jones. The second was Ivy Ellington. And the third is the Ogle House? No. At the Page Walker? It was the Matthews House. Was it the Matthews House? Okay, yeah.
Does anyone know what's going to be going in the Ashworth Drugstore building?
I have not heard what, I think they were looking for a store or business to go in there, but I have not heard if one has been found yet.
Yes.
I think he owns the building. I don't know if it's for sale. Is it?
It's not for sale. They own it. Family owns it.
Family owns it, okay. Anyone else? No? Thank you so much for coming.